Students, we have finally reached the most important slide in Alan Tate's entire theory. Everything we studied before was preparation for this moment. We learned, extension equals literal meaning. Intention equals figurative meaning. Now Tate tells us how these two combine to create the true meaning of poetry. Look carefully at the diagram. You see two overlapping circles. One circle represents extension, literal meaning. The other circle represents intention, figurative meaning. The shaded area where they overlap is the most important part of the diagram. That overlapping area is called poetic unity. And poetic unity is what Tate calls tension. Understanding the diagram, think of these circles as two forces working inside every great poem. The first force asks, what does the poem literally say? The second force asks, what does the poem suggest beyond the literal meaning? A great poem does not choose one over the other. Instead, it brings them together. The meeting point creates poetic power. That meeting point is tension. Tate's famous definition. The slide gives one of Tate's most important statements. Greater than, the meaning of poetry is its tension, the full organized body of all the extension and intention that we can find in it. Let us simplify this sentence. Tate is saying, the meaning of a poem is not found only in literal meaning. The meaning of a poem is not found only in symbolism. The true meaning of a poem comes from the organized union of both. That organized union is called tension. The phrase, full organized body. Pay special attention to these words. Full. Tate wants us to consider every meaning. Not just one meaning. Not just the obvious meaning. All meanings. Organized. The meanings are not random. They work together. A great poem is carefully structured. Its meanings support one another. Body. A poem contains many meanings. Together they form one unified whole. That whole is tension. Example, Shakespeare's Sonnet 18. Consider, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Extension. The speaker compares someone to a summer day. This is the literal level. Intention. Summer suggests beauty, warmth, youth, vitality, happiness. Tension. The line becomes powerful because both meanings operate together. We understand the literal comparison. We also understand the symbolic associations. The combination creates poetic richness. That richness is tension. Example, Robert Frost. The woods are lovely, dark and deep. Extension. A forest is being described. That is the literal reality. Intention. The woods may suggest mystery, escape, death, spiritual reflection, inner peace, tension. Both meanings exist simultaneously. Neither cancels the other. Together they create the poem's power. First bullet point. The slide says, good poetry is a unity of all meanings from the furthest extremes. This is one of Tate's most important ideas. Great poetry brings together opposites. For example, thought and emotion, logic and imagination, reality and symbolism, concrete and abstract, particular and universal. Most ordinary language focuses on one side. Poetry unites both sides. Example, a rose is concrete, an actual flower, but it is also abstract, a symbol of love and beauty. Poetry allows both meanings to coexist. This coexistence creates tension. Why Tate loves unity? For Tate, the highest achievement of poetry is unity. A poem may contain many meanings, many emotions, many symbols, many ideas, yet it must feel like one complete experience. Think about an orchestra. There may be violins, drums, flutes, trumpets, different sounds, different tones, different rhythms, yet together they create one piece of music. Poetry works in the same way. Tension is the principle that unifies all parts. Second bullet point. The slide says, the figurative complications do not contradict or invalidate the literal reality. This is extremely important. Students often think symbolism replaces literal meaning. Tate disagrees. The symbolic meaning should grow from the literal meaning, not destroy it. Example, consider a river in poetry. Literal meaning, flowing water. Figurative meaning, time, life, change, human journey. The symbolic meanings do not cancel the river. The river remains a river. Both meanings coexist. This coexistence is tension. What happens in weak poetry? Weak poetry often loses balance. Some poems become too literal. They contain facts but little emotional depth. Others become too symbolic. They become vague and difficult to understand. Great poetry maintains balance. It keeps both extension and intention alive. A beautiful analogy. Imagine a pair of scissors. One blade represents extension. The other blade represents intention. Can a single blade cut paper? No. Both blades must work together. Similarly, extension alone cannot create poetry. Intention alone cannot create poetry. Poetry emerges when both operate together. That cooperation is tension. The central insight of Alan Tate. The biggest mistake readers make is searching for only one meaning. Tate teaches us that poetry is richer than that. A poem contains literal meanings, emotional meanings, symbolic meanings, intellectual meanings. The greatness of poetry lies in organizing all these meanings into one unified experience. That unified experience is called tension. Examination gold point most important definition. According to Alan Tate, tension is the complete organized unity of all the literal, extension, and figurative, intention, meanings present in a poem. Quick revision formula. Extension equals what the poem says. Intention equals what the poem suggests. Tension equals the total meaning created when both work together. Or remember, literal meaning plus figurative meaning equals poetic unity. Poetic unity equals tension. This is the central definition of Alan Tate's theory and the foundation of his contribution to new criticism. After defining tension, Alan Tate now explains why some poems fail. Look at the image carefully. We see a rope stretched between two sides. Notice that the rope is breaking at both ends. This is Tate's central message. Poetry can fail in two opposite ways. A great poem stays balanced in the middle. A weak poem moves too far toward one extreme. First extreme, the fallacy of mere denotation. Look at the left side. The slide says, too much logic, zero emotion. The word denotation means the dictionary or literal meaning of words. Tate says some poems become so logical and factual that they stop being poetry. They become like reports or scientific statements. For example, the tree is 20 feet high. The temperature is 30 degrees. These statements may be accurate, but they do not create a poetic experience. They provide information but not imagination. They have extension but very little intention. As a result, the poem feels dry and lifeless. This is what Tate calls the fallacy of mere denotation. Second extreme, the fallacy of communication. Now look at the right side. The slide says, too much emotion, broken logic. This is the opposite problem. Some poems focus only on emotional impact. The poet wants readers to feel something immediately but does not provide enough structure or clear imagery. For example, love, beauty, passion, eternity. These words sound emotional, but if they are not connected to concrete images or experiences, they become vague. The reader feels emotion but cannot clearly understand the poem. Such writing resembles propaganda or emotional persuasion rather than true poetry. This is what Tate calls the fallacy of communication. Why the rope breaks? The rope represents poetry. Notice that it breaks at both ends. Tate is teaching us that too much logic destroys poetry. Too much emotion also destroys poetry. A poem cannot survive at either extreme. The strength of poetry lies in balance. The ideal position. The best poetry stands in the middle. It combines literal meaning and symbolic meaning, logic and emotion, structure and imagination. Think of Shakespeare's line, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" The line contains a real image, a summer day, but it also carries emotional and symbolic meanings such as beauty, warmth, and youth. Neither side dominates. The balance creates poetic power. Tate's method of criticism. Look at the sentence at the bottom. Tate evaluates poetry by identifying exactly where it snaps on this scale. This means that when Tate reads a poem, he asks, does it fail because it is too logical? Or does it fail because it is too emotional? The answer helps him judge the poem's quality. Quick revision. Fallacy of mere denotation. Too much extension. Too much logic. Too many facts. Dry poetry. Fallacy of communication. Too much intention. Too much emotion. Weak structure. Vague poetry. Great poetry. Balance between both. Extension plus intention. Creates tension. One-line examination answer. According to Alan Tate, poetry fails when it moves to either extreme, pure denotation, excessive logic, or pure communication, excessive emotion. Great poetry maintains a balance between extension and intention, creating tension. In the previous slide, we learned that poetry can fail in two different ways. Now Alan Tate examines the first failure in detail. The fallacy of communication. This is one of the most important concepts in the essay. Many examination questions come directly from this topic. What is the fallacy of communication? Look at the core concept box. It says, poetry that attempts to bypass logic to directly inject an affective state, emotion, into the reader. This sounds complicated, but the idea is simple. Tate is talking about poetry that tries to make readers feel something immediately without first creating meaning through language and structure. In other words, the poet is not trying to build an artistic experience. The poet is simply trying to create an emotional reaction. Understanding. Bypassing logic. What does bypass logic mean? It means skipping the logical and literal foundation of the poem. Remember, extension equals logical foundation. Intention equals emotional and symbolic meaning. A good poem begins with extension and then develops intention. The fallacy of communication ignores extension and jumps directly to emotion. Simple example. Imagine someone repeatedly shouting, "Be brave, be brave, be brave." The words may create excitement. But is this poetry? Not necessarily. It is simply an attempt to produce emotion. There is no imagery, no structure, no artistic complexity, no tension. Why Tate criticizes this? Tate believes poetry should not manipulate emotions directly. Instead, poetry should allow emotions to emerge naturally from the poem's structure. The reader should experience emotion because of the poem's imagery, symbols, and language, not because the poet is commanding the reader to feel something. The flaw. Now look at the second box. It says, relies on mass language and vague feelings. This connects directly to the earlier slide about propaganda. Mass language is language designed for large audiences. Examples include political slogans, advertisements, campaign speeches, propaganda. Such language often focuses on emotional effect rather than artistic truth. Example, consider a slogan, support the nation. This may inspire emotion, but it is very general. It does not provide detailed images. It does not encourage deep interpretation. It communicates emotion quickly. Tate says poetry should be richer than this. Vague feelings. Tate also criticizes vague emotional language. For example, love, beauty, hope, glory. These words sound powerful, but if they are not connected to concrete images, they become empty. Readers may feel something briefly, but the poem lacks depth. Why does it fail as art? The slide says, fails as art because it lacks objective content and cannot withstand literal examination. This is extremely important. Tate asks, what happens if we examine the poem carefully? Does it contain clear images? Does it contain logical relationships? Does it contain meaningful structure? If the answer is no, then the poem fails. Example, suppose a poem contains only emotional words. When we analyze it closely, we discover there is very little substance underneath. The poem sounds impressive at first, but deeper examination reveals weakness. Tate believes great poetry should become stronger when examined closely, not weaker. Diagnostic. The slide gives a diagnosis, a failure in denotation, extension. This means the poem lacks a strong literal foundation. The emotional language is present, but the logical structure is missing. The most important sentence. Look at the final statement. The words sound emotional but make no logical sense together. This is the clearest sign of the fallacy of communication. The poem creates emotional noise, but not meaningful art. Easy analogy. Imagine building a house. Emotion is the decoration. Extension is the foundation. If you decorate a house without building a foundation, the house collapses. Similarly, a poem cannot survive on emotion alone. It needs structure. It needs logic. It needs extension. Connection to tension. Remember Tate's formula. Extension plus intention equals tension. The fallacy of communication occurs when intention becomes too strong and extension becomes too weak. As a result, tension disappears. The balance is destroyed. Quick revision. Core concept. Direct emotional impact. Bypasses logic. Main flaw. Relies on vague feelings. Resembles propaganda. Diagnosis. Weak extension. Strong but uncontrolled intention. Result. Emotional language without artistic depth. According to Alan Tate, the fallacy of communication occurs when a poem tries to produce emotion directly while neglecting logical and literal structure, resulting in weak artistic value and a failure of extension. Theory becomes easier when we see it applied to a real poem. In this slide, Alan Tate gives us a practical example of what he calls the fallacy of communication. He uses a poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay to show how a poem can fail when emotion becomes disconnected from literal meaning. What is happening here? Look at the lines quoted in the center. See now the slug and the mildew plunder. Evil does overwhelm the larkspur and the corn. At first glance, the poem seems emotional and serious. We feel that something bad is happening. There is a mood of destruction and sadness. But Tate asks an important question. Does the literal meaning actually support the intended emotion? This is where the problem begins. The literal meaning. Look at the note on the left. It says, literal meaning. Crops are rotting. What do the words literally describe? They describe slugs, mildew, damaged crops, corn being affected. In simple terms, the poem literally talks about agricultural decay. Plants are suffering. Crops are being destroyed. That is the extension, the intended emotion. Now look at the second note. It says, intended emotion, grief over the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti. This is completely different. The poet wants readers to feel sorrow and outrage over the execution of two controversial political figures. So the emotional goal is political grief. The problem according to Tate. Now Tate asks, what is the connection between rotting crops and political execution? Can readers logically move from one to the other? Is the relationship clearly established? Tate says, no, the connection is weak. The poem wants us to feel political grief. But the literal images do not clearly lead us there. Why this is a failure? Remember Tate's formula. Extension plus intention equals tension. In a successful poem, the literal meaning supports the emotional meaning. The two work together, but here, according to Tate, the two are disconnected. Extension, rotting crops, intention, political grief, problem. The bridge between them is unclear. Because the connection is weak, the poem fails to create true tension. An everyday example. Imagine a student writing, the classroom fan is broken, but then claiming the sentence symbolizes the collapse of world democracy. Could such symbolism be possible? Yes, but the writer must carefully establish the connection. If no connection is developed, readers become confused. The symbolism feels forced. This is exactly the problem Tate sees here. Understanding the note on the right. The slide says, the literal words are completely unrelated to the intended affective state. The phrase, affective state, simply means emotional state. Tate believes the poem wants readers to feel grief. But the literal imagery does not adequately justify that feeling. As a result, the poem depends on emotion rather than artistic structure. Why Tate chooses this example? Tate is not attacking emotion itself. Remember, he believes emotion is necessary in poetry. The problem is not emotion. The problem is emotion without sufficient grounding in literal meaning. He wants emotion and logic to work together, not separately. The larger lesson. This case study teaches us a very important rule. A poet cannot simply decide what readers should feel. The poem must earn those feelings through its imagery, structure, and language. Readers should arrive at emotion through the poem itself, not through external explanation. According to Alan Tate, Malay's poem fails because its literal imagery of agricultural decay does not adequately support its intended emotional response of grief over the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti. Therefore, it becomes an example of the fallacy of communication because intention overwhelms extension. Quick revision. Literal meaning: extension, slugs, mildew, rotting crops, agricultural decay. Intended emotion: intention, political grief. Mourning Sacco and Vanzetti. Tate's criticism: weak connection between the two. Emotion not supported by literal imagery. Failure of tension. Result: example of the fallacy of communication. One-line examination answer. Alan Tate uses Edna St. Vincent Millay's poem as an example of the fallacy of communication because its intended emotional meaning, grief over Sacco and Vanzetti, is not adequately supported by its literal imagery of crop decay, creating a failure of poetic tension. In the previous slide, Alan Tate showed us one example of the fallacy of communication using Edna St. Vincent Millay. Now he presents another example, this time from James Thomson. The purpose is the same. Tate wants to show what happens when a poem's imagery becomes so confused that its literal meaning collapses. The poetic lines. Look at the lines in the center. The wine of love is music. He reeleth with his own heart. That great rich vine. At first reading, these lines sound beautiful. The language appears poetic. The words seem emotional and musical. Many readers may immediately think, this must be great poetry. But Tate asks us to do something different. He asks us to examine the poem closely. The new critical method. Remember what new critics always ask: what do the words literally mean? Not what we feel, not what we assume, not what the poet may have intended, but what the words themselves actually say. Breaking down the images. Let us look carefully. The poem contains several different images. Wine. Wine suggests drinking and intoxication. Love. Love suggests emotion and affection. Music. Music belongs to sound and art. Vine. A vine is a plant that produces grapes. Heart. The heart symbolizes emotion or feeling. Now ask yourself, how exactly do all these images fit together? Wine becomes music. Music becomes love. Love becomes a vine. The heart becomes intoxicated. The images keep shifting. Tate's criticism. Tate is not saying that metaphor is bad. Poetry needs metaphor. The problem arises when metaphors become so mixed that readers lose a clear sense of meaning. Instead of creating unity, the images create confusion. Understanding the note. The slide says, the imagery is a confused clutter. A clutter is a collection of things thrown together without proper organization. That is Tate's criticism. The poem contains many attractive images, but they are not carefully controlled. As a result, the imagery becomes tangled. Why this matters? Remember Tate's definition of great poetry. A good poem should unite. Extension. Intention. The literal meaning should support the figurative meaning. The figurative meaning should grow naturally from the literal meaning. In this poem, Tate believes that relationship breaks down. The test of paraphrase. Look at the second box. It says, paraphrasing it yields a confused image. What is paraphrasing? It means putting the poem into ordinary language. Tate often tests poetry by asking, what happens if we explain the image literally? Applying the test. If we paraphrase the passage, we get something strange. A man drinks wine. The wine becomes music. The music becomes love. The love becomes a vine. The man becomes intoxicated by his own heart. The result is difficult to visualize clearly. The image becomes unstable. Close reading problem. The slide says, it falls apart under close literal reading. This is the key criticism. At first glance, the poem sounds impressive. But when we analyze the words carefully, the imagery becomes confusing. The poem creates emotional atmosphere but lacks clear structural control. For Tate, this is a serious weakness. The central lesson. Tate is teaching us an important principle. Beautiful language alone does not make great poetry. A poem must also possess coherence. Its images must work together. Its symbols must support one another. Its meanings must remain connected. Otherwise, tension collapses. Connection to extension. Notice the box on the right. A failure in denotation. Denotation means literal meaning. Tate believes the literal structure of the imagery is weak. The poem has intention. It has emotional richness, but its extension is unstable. As a result, the poem loses balance. Everyday analogy. Imagine someone says, "My friendship is a river, a song, a fire, a mountain, and a cloud." Each image individually may be meaningful, but if too many unrelated images are piled together, listeners become confused. Instead of increasing meaning, the images begin to compete with one another. This is what Tate sees happening here. Quick revision. Images used: wine, love, music, vine, heart. Tate's criticism. Images are not clearly unified. Literal meaning becomes confusing. Imagery becomes cluttered. Result: failure in denotation. Extension falls apart under close reading. Larger lesson. Great poetry requires controlled imagery. Emotional richness alone is not enough. Extension and intention must remain balanced. One-line examination answer. Alan Tate criticizes James Thomson's imagery because its metaphors become confused and overcrowded, creating a failure in denotation. Extension. Under close reading, the imagery loses coherence and therefore fails to achieve true poetic tension.